Well, just when I thought things in the world were quieting down, things have gotten a little crazy. Welcome tonight. I wanted to let you know that this week we decided to schedule a bunch of events for November and December that we weren't previously planning. And so keep your mailboxes posted and go to our website. But there's too much going on for us to do what my original plan was, which was to do a lot of very small, quiet events. So keep looking. And if there's anything you want us to do that we're not doing, let us know. And if we can fit it in, we will. But I think you're going to be excited by what's coming up. Tonight, we're doing an event that actually we planned to do how long ago? A year? What happens in our world when somebody tries to tell their story and they happen to be somebody on the inside? They write a book, and then they're told, well, you have to submit it to vetting. And then you find out that it's not just one agency that you have to vet it with, it's more than one agency that you have to vet it with. This is not the first time this has happened to a book that has been presented at the center, Ali Soufan's being one as well. So I think you're going to be very interested in tonight's conversation. I'm so happy that this book has finally come out. Let me introduce our panelists, and then we can get started. Yes, this book. Thank you.
Do you want a copy?
Okay. So Mark Fallon, I'm going to introduce him the way I always introduce everybody, which is how I got to know him. So when I was writing my book on Guantanamo, because it was a long time ago, there weren't a lot of people willing to talk to us who had actually been attached to the government and who knew things that journalists and writers and just interested public needed to know. And Mark was somebody who did not put himself out there as, well, you know, a flag waving, I have information to tell you. But if you waited long enough and you were patient enough and you knew enough people, he would talk to you. And he talked to me and explained to me, as very few other people did, how things worked inside. Not who was a good guy and who was a bad guy. That wasn't even the nature of the conversation. It was just what the lines of authority were, what the lines of authority were not, and how I should go about the rest of my research. And so he was incredibly helpful at the time. Afterwards, I ran into him in a number of capacities in the intervening years. But it was always clear to me that this was somebody of great integrity who had a story of his own to tell. And I wish more people from inside the government would share their stories with us and not play it like a shell game, like if you wait long enough, maybe this, you know, I'll reveal something and you guys can, on the outside, can put it all together. So we don't have a lot of books like this. And this is one I encourage you to read, and I think you'll get a really appreciation for this tonight. I also want to introduce Carol Rosenberg. Now, it's hard to introduce Carol because I feel like she's so much part of the fabric of everything we do that she really should need no introduction. But just in case she needs an introduction for any of you, Carol is the single human being who has been at Guantanamo since the day it opened. She has witnessed everything that has gone on there, both that which she's told us and that which she has not told us. When the dust all clears and Guantanamo is closed, she is going to be the only person whose eyes and ears have watched it from the very, very beginning. One thing Carol told me when it opened, the day it opened, when the first plane load of detainees arrived at Guantanamo, Carol once told me, she said, "You don't know what it felt like. I realized that I was the only, whatever I reported was the only thing people would know about what was there. There were no pictures. There weren't going to be any, cameras. There wasn't going to be any reliable other sorts. That the burden of saying what she saw was, sort of like in the old days, the way a reporter used to be. And so she understood from the very beginning the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders, and she's kept it until now. So if we did give awards, which we don't at the center, I would definitely, this is your almost award. That's as good as it's going to get. We would give her an award for just making it possible for all the rest of us to have our thoughts and do our work. So without any further ado, they'll have a conversation, then there'll be a little bit of Q&A, and then we can all go have some coffee and cookies. Thank you.
I just wanted to correct one thing, which is, no, it's fine.
What did I get wrong?
There were 3 other people who were still
Yes,
there
but
the day it
you-
opened.
yeah,
And
no.
they're
Who?
3 detainees who arrived that first day.
Oh, yeah, of course, the detainee. This is a good point, yeah.
But, 20 people arrived that day. They were the worst of the worst, and 17 got to go for different reasons. And Mark probably knows more about those 17, or those first 20 than I will ever know. But,
I don't think your mic is low.
should I make it louder? Oh,
It's fine, don't worry.
you couldn't hear me there.
I believe that I can tell it was I can
It's
tell.
very nice to be conversation. So I wanted to say how pleased I was that the center had invited me to do this. I come from Guantanamo. I'm going back on Sunday, and Karen invited me to be a moderator, and it's like one of my favorite things to do, which is ask questions, and that's not always welcome at Guantanamo, so it's very nice to be able to do that here. And Mark's book chronicles the infighting from the earliest days, in the first 2 years at Gitmo, between those who wanted to do it by the book and those who bought into the dark side and decided that they needed to go a different way. And Mark is uniquely situated to talk about it. So the first thing I want to do is ask him to take 5 or 10 minutes, tell us why you wrote the book and what you think we should know about the book. And then I have lots of questions.
Sure. Well, yes. Thank you, Carol. And Karen, it's really an honor to be here, particularly with you, Carol, because for years I avoided you when we had nothing to do with you. So it's kind of interesting to be sitting here and actually have you ask me questions, because I would keep you on the other side of the island away from our guys back in the day when our guys first arrived at Guantanamo. Let me talk about why I wrote the book. I felt compelled to. Those of us who serve, who have served the government, we take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. And that means something to us who served. We pledge that allegiance to that document, what it stands for, what it embodies. Al-Qaeda pledges allegiance to people. We pledge allegiance to the Constitution. And over the years, I've seen the public misled. I've seen the president misled. I've seen the Congress misled, and the media is misled about these tactics, these horrific tactics that we applied on human beings. And so as time went on, I know back a number of years when we were debating these issues, I was not authorized to talk. The first time I spoke out on these issues, the Department of Defense asked me to. I did an interview with a journalist named Bill Dedman, and the Department of Defense thought this was a good news story about how people in the department stood up against torture. And at the time, we didn't realize how deep it went, how pervasive it was, how high it went in the government. And immediately after those articles were published, I was told never, ever to speak to the media again as long as I was with the Department of Defense. And so I left the Department of Defense. As time went on, what became bothersome to me was the fact that those people who did these horrific crimes, and these are crimes, these are war crimes. These are violations of the Convention Against Torture. These are violations of the U.S. Constitution, the 4th, 8th Amendment, the 5th Amendment. I mean, there were so many egregious things that I saw that our country did it in secret. I mean, they never intended anyone to know the level of depravity that we would stoop to, how deep we would go down that slippery slope to the level of our adversaries, rather than raise up to the level of what we should stand for as that shining city on the hill. And so as I saw some of these folks who were involved in this program, they came out with a communication strategy. And the strategy was that these techniques were safe, they were necessary, and they were effective. And they were all lies. None of that is true. They were not safe, they were not necessary, nor were they effective. And that communication strategy, in the tradecraft of intelligence, it's called perception management or counterintelligence. To manage the perceptions of an adversary was used to manage the perceptions of the American public. And so as we went down that road, we had the Central Intelligence Agency, whose core competency was not renditions, detention, or interrogation, was given that mission on the 17th of September 2001, based on fear, ignorance, and arrogance. And so we went down a road, a path, giving an agency who had little to no legitimate experience doing interviews and interrogations, unlike the Hollywood version of the CIA, and took away the jurisdiction from an agency that had done it very effectively over the years, the FBI. And I'd worked with them over the years on joint terrorism task forces. And they intentionally did this in secret. And as I saw those techniques gravitate to the Department of Defense in 2002, I stood up on the inside. And to be honest with you, I hope these things never became public, because I at the time I knew what that would do to inflame violent extremists around the world. I mean, to think that the United States of America would stoop to the levels of our adversaries, that we would treat people with such inhumanity. And what compelled me to write the book was when some of these people who were part of that communication strategy started to write their own books. And so the person in the CIA who was in the communication shop for George Tenet was a guy named Bill Harlow. And Bill Harlow would articulate that strategy while he was with the government. Safe, necessary, and effective. We're doing this to protect you. And then when George Tenet wrote his book, he wrote it with Bill Harlow. And then when Jose Rodriguez, who headed the RDI program, wrote his book, he wrote it with Bill Harlow. And when the Senate Select Committee of Intelligence came out with their report, a series of essays from CIA people who were involved in the program, directors, assistant directors, was compiled to counter the six-year investigation of our torture program. A series of essays came out. And who edited it? Bill Harlow. And Jim Mitchell, who created the program, a seer psychologist, a psychologist with no operational psychologist experience in interviews and interrogations, no experience with Al-Qaeda, no experience in the Middle East, created this program of torture. He wrote a book, and it was written with Bill Harlow. And so you have people who continue to try to manipulate the public, to manipulate you with these communication strategies that's safe, necessary, and effective. So I wanted to set the record straight. I wanted to set the record straight about how our national security has been degraded by this. The terrible effects, the terrible cost and consequence, tactically, operationally, and strategically from torture. And so that's what's bringing me here today. That was a long answer to your question.
And I take it you didn't go to Bill Harlow when you set out to write the book to see if he'd help you?
I did not. I did not go to Bill Harlow.
So I just want to back up a little, depending on people's level of knowledge. You write in the book that NCIS and FBI were best positioned at that moment when Guantanamo opened to take the lead on these interrogations. Can you explain why?
Yeah. So for those of you who watch the NCIS television show, sorry you don't have Mark Harmon or LL Cool J here. But you know, the NCIS is a very unique organization within the government because the Navy and Marine Corps years ago decided that they were sailors and Marines, and they would outsource a capability to get a professional cadre of criminal investigators and counterintelligence specialists to provide a service and support to the department globally. And so based on that position, I had started with NCIS in 1981. And at the time of the September 11 attacks, I was what was called the Chief of Counterintelligence Operations for the Europe, Africa, Middle East Division. And my responsibilities at the time was as the commander of the USS Cole Task Force. And so on the 12th of October 2000, the USS Cole was attacked in Aden, Yemen. We lost 17 sailors that day. And my counterpart was a guy named John O'Neill from the FBI, and it was a joint NCIS and FBI investigation into the attack of the Cole. And NCIS had two responsibilities. As criminal investigators, we investigated jointly with the FBI. But as the counterintelligence component of the Department of Navy, We're also there to collect intelligence and send out threat warning information to the fleet to prevent further attacks. And I had a long history, particularly with the JTTF here in New York, because I had worked the first Trade Center bombing. I supported that. And I worked the case on the blind Sheikh Omar al-Darrahman, back in the 90s when they were plotting to blow up the United Nations and the Honolulu Lincoln tunnels. So I had a fair degree of experience at the time, having jointly investigated with the FBI. And we developed what I thought was the model during the Cole investigation. Because what we did is we recognized that everyone had equities. NCIS in our counterintelligence programs within the United States coordinates with the FBI as the domestic security counterintelligence organization. And overseas, we do our coordination with the CIA. That's mandated by policy. And so when the Cole was attacked, we had to decide, how do we protect everybody's equities? How do we ensure that we do a criminal investigation, as well as collect intelligence and disseminate that to prevent further attacks, to protect the fleet, for threat warning information. And so the model program that we developed was, we said to the CIA, you don't do this for a living. You don't know how to do interviews and interrogations. We do. We have done that. We do this for a living. This is part and parcel to being a criminal investigator, is being able to talk to people. So the intelligence isn't the interrogation. The intelligence is what comes out of that interrogation. So let the people best suited to do those interviews do them, and then you can disseminate to the broader intelligence community through your channels that intelligence. With NCIS, our responsibility was to disseminate intelligence to the Department of Defense, and we did that. And then we jointly wrote investigative reports with the FBI for potential trials before Article 3 or federal courts. And so that was a model that I thought should have translated after 9/11.
And isn't it fair to say that that organization, that combined organization, possibly knew more about Al-Qaeda at that moment than any other intelligence?
Yeah, the FBI particularly, the Joint Terror, the FBI NYPD, as they refer to it here in New York, Joint Terrorism Task Force, had a squad here in New York City called the I-49 Squad. And any case that was bin Laden related went to that squad. They had another squad in DC, Radical Fundamentalist Group. And so the core competencies for investigating Al-Qaeda or knowing Al-Qaeda was resident within the FBI, particularly here in New York City. The office here had worked the East Africa embassy bombing cases, worked the Cole case, the First World Trade Center. And so you had core group of professionals who had sources within Al-Qaeda, who had worked Al-Qaeda. And so the problem with that memorandum of notification that the president did on the 17th of September was he turned his back on the agency that had the most depth of experience and turned his back on the Article 3 courts, our constitutional court system, and said that they are not capable of trying terrorists in federal courts, when historically we actually had been. We had been very successful at that, and the FBI had been very successful, and during the Cole, all of those interviews were joint, NCIS, FBI agents, and so there were individuals with great depth of experience with a proven track record that we ignored by turning to an organization, the CIA, who really lacked any depth of experience doing the mission that they received.
In your book, you cast that as a very fateful decision.
Yeah.
That led to the abuses that you quite vividly describe in your book in detail. The improvisations, if you will, to try to go outside the norms of interrogation. And you conclude on page 178 that in the process, the U.S. created a national policy of state-sponsored torture. You spent 2 years at Gitmo. At what point in those 2 years did you realize that had happened?
Yeah, well, I didn't spend 2 years at Gitmo. Most of my time was...
You spent 2 years in the role...
Yeah. So, and that, a lot of people say I was at Gitmo all that time. A lot of people call me an interrogator, and I just
You spent 2 years in a role that oversaw or was aware of the behavior down there.
Exactly. But I think it's an important distinction where an interrogator talks to somebody for information. An investigator is responsible for managing a case. And so they use an interrogation or interview as part of what they do. But it's collecting evidence, doing background information, witnesses, corroboration. So it's much more involved than just an interrogation. And the task force wasn't at Gitmo. I mean, the FBI officers aren't in prisons. Okay, so our case agents were up in Fort Belvoir, and we had forward deployed units at Guantanamo, and our case agents would travel there, but we had units in Afghanistan and Iraq, Kabul, Kandahar, Bagram, and so it was an investigative task force to collect all the information we could about a particular individual. But
in the process
right.
of collecting that information, you became aware that something quite sinister was going on.
Yeah, for sure. So when the CITF and the FBI identified a detainee named Mohammed al-Qahtani, who was likely the 20th hijacker, was a missing hijacker from one of the aircraft, the one that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. As we were looking at who should have primacy on talking to Qahtani, I went to the Pentagon because, what was shocking for me, frankly, about getting this mission, at the time, it was really unbelievable to me that we would turn away from the FBI, who had the lion's share of experience, and give this mission to the Department of Defense and me. I mean, I was the chief investigator for this, became a 230-person task force. But it was a lawful order. While I didn't agree with it, I had a responsibility to execute it as a senior manager within the government. And so as we identified Mohammed al-Qahtani as the likely 20th hijacker, someone who was involved, we were trying to determine, and through my career, NCIS is a very small organization, and sometimes you work with giants. Those three-letter organizations, have a lot of resources, and we just try to do our mission and get by. And so you're used to looking at everyone's equities, because to protect my equities for my organization, I need to ensure that your equities are protected also, and that's why I explained what we did with the USS Cole. We understood the CIA had equities, we understood the FBI had equities, so we tried to design a process so that everybody was happy. And so when we had Qahtani at Guantanamo,
where he remains as an uncharged indefinite detainee.
Correct. So as we were looking at him, my thought process was I went to the Pentagon to argue that the first people to talk to Qahtani should be the FBI, because they had no jurisdiction over the detainees at Guantanamo. We actually had blanket declinations from the Department of Justice for any person that we were investigating at the CITF, any of the folks at Guantanamo. But I knew the capabilities of the FBI, and I actually requested that one of the FBI agents who do the interrogation, I can't mention his name because it's been redacted from my book.
We'll get to that.
But I thought the nice part about that is that their equities were to protect national security, so any threat information they needed, and any information they got, we knew it would be lawfully obtained, so we could use it at CITF.
So was the first order of interest to see if you could get him to talk about sleeper cells?
When you're doing an investigation, you're looking at all of the information. It's not just, we want a confession to try you, particularly the FBI, because they had no jurisdiction for the military commissions. They were looking for information about future attacks. They were talking to Qahtani for intelligence purposes, from a criminal investigative and counterintelligence organization. The second people that I articulated should be the CITF. And so let the FBI do their job, and then the CITF, as the investigative arm for the Office of Military Commissions, should then talk to Qahtani, and then after that, we will let JTF 170, later became JTF Gitmo, talk to them in case they got goofy, in case they did things, because they were very primitive in their approaches, they were not well trained, and they were ill-equipped to actually do this mission, frankly. And so we thought that my thought process, which I argued successfully at the Pentagon, I was reporting to the Office of Secretary of Defense, the Office of General Counsel for the Department of Defense. I was effective in that argument at the time until a general named Dunleavy who was down there, who you know and have dealt with, decided after the FBI started to run into some roadblocks and Catani stopped talking, that law enforcement had their chance, so we need to now get tougher. And so the CITF doesn't get a chance to talk to Catani. We're going to talk to him, and we need special techniques like the CIA is using. Because at the time I mentioned that this perception management, at the time, the CIA, the rumor intelligence.
Examples include forced nudity, short shackling, sleep deprivation, noises, hot, cold, threatened with dogs, humiliated by women.
Correct.
What have I missed?
Yeah, isolation. I mean, there was mock executions that occurred and other things. But at that time, when I saw the CIA come to Gitmo, and actually before they did, I saw a group of senior lawyers come to Guantanamo. I knew that we were in for some troubling, challenging times ahead.
So is that the point where you thought we were creating a national policy of state-sponsored torture? Or did it?
Yeah, and no doubt about it. Up until that point, I had thought that this was just decisions of incompetence. Working for the Navy and Marine Corps, you often have to tell truth to power. Admirals and generals aren't criminal investigators, aren't counterintelligence professionals. So through my career, I've had to have those difficult conversations. I've had to go into commanding officers or commanding generals or admirals and tell them things that they didn't want to hear. But that was my job, so you had to do it. So
Mohammed Khatani was interrogated, according to many accounts, including your book, in late 2002 in Camp X-Ray.
Correct.
Months and months after the detention center talking point was that Camp X-Ray was closed and out of business, and any picture you saw of what went on in those cages was history to be ignored. And this went on long after Camp X-Ray was ostensibly closed.
Yeah, correct. That part of the interrogation strategy by the Department of Defense adopting the SEER techniques that were being utilized by the CIA. And what's important for the audience, I think, to recognize is what this is. So SEER is survive, evade, resist, and escape. And so what we did is we, the U.S. government, looked at the manner in which our prisoners were abused by the North Koreans and by communist interrogation tactics, which were just what you described. And there were actually congressional hearings in 1955 or 56. John F. Kennedy was a senator then. And what they did is they looked at why our service members were providing propaganda information, why they're providing false information under these interrogations, which are more psychological tactics than physical tactics. These conditions, they created the conditions, they were trying to produce debility, dependency, and dread. And so and isolation is a key component of that, by putting someone in isolation. In
an abandoned camp of cages where the last time he was there, he was in the company of 300 people.
Correct. But what I think is important to recognize is, while the narrative that the CIA put out was that we re-engineered these tactics, we didn't. We adopted them. We adopted them technique by technique. And there was an Air Force sociologist named Albert Bitterman who did a study in 1957. And the study is Communist Techniques to Produce False Confessions.
Whose name is not redacted in this book. Correct. Some of the names do get through. So, on page 88, you write of being so alarmed by what you saw and seeing it as so at odds with your understanding of the Constitution you were swore to defend, that you wrote that you thought of one day swearing out charges under the UCMJ against certain people. And as I read it some months ago, I wondered, was that an actual ambition or was that a fantasy?
Yeah. Well, I've had to interrogate generals before and read them their rights, and SEAL team commanders and other things. And for me, one of the things that concerned me, and folks, when they came to the CITF, the task force that I was the deputy commander of, there were a few things that, and my job was to set the tone, to set the climate, to be a leader. I wasn't in the interrogation booth. I went in a couple times to kind of see what it was like, and I watched through the mirror. But I had guys on the ground, true patriots, who were doing service to this country, working tirelessly to try to bring terrorists to justice. But
Not using those techniques we just
yeah, correct. Never using them. But one of the concerns I had, so I told everyone, and I don't know why I picked Peoria, but I said, make sure whatever you do, that you wouldn't mind seeing the Peoria Times. And I know Britt Malla, who was the commanding officer, rest his soul, he's no longer with us, but he told everyone in the task force, your grandchildren are going to look back about what you did during the war, and make sure you make them proud. And so what I was always actually concerned about was if one of my agents, one of our agents, one of your agents, worked for the government, they weren't my agents, saw a felony committed in their presence, might they be compelled to do something about it? If I saw a detainee being tortured in my presence, would I feel compelled to act? And so I don't know what the answer to that question is.
But you didn't have to see it. You knew it was going on.
I knew it was going on, but knowing it was going on and reporting it, and I'd worked a lot of undercover operations, and oftentimes I equated this, I felt like I was an undercover agent in a criminal enterprise. And so I was trying to collect and report back the information that I was getting from folks on the ground back through my chains of command, which were through the Office of Secretary of Defense, back through the Secretary of the Army. And when both of those failed to respond, I went back to my parent organization, NCIS, and said, listen, we're going down a road that I'm troubled by. And Dave Brandt, the director, gave me the authority to withdraw from the task force. And he said, you can pull everyone, if it gets that bad. And it was challenging for me as a leader because I couldn't put my people in a position where they would observe this. One, if they acted, it would have been bad for everybody. If they didn't act, it would still be bad for everybody. So I didn't want, if they were going down this road, I didn't want the agents that I led observing that, but I had access to logs. And so I was monitoring the logs that the torture was occurring. And there was a point when there's a Tom Clancy movie where Harrison Ford is in the CIA headquarters and he's trying to get documents out before the other guy is shredding them. And that's what I felt like, because I was shooting documents to NCIS headquarters, to friends on the classified network, say, keep these documents. This is evidence. I don't know what's going to happen here. I had a hand truck on my office and empty boxes. I thought I was going to be fired. I mean, I saw they fired General Backus, the general down there. They were moving people out of the way that were standing up. And Britt Malla and I, we talked about it. We thought we'd be next. And so I had my exit strategy, sending documents saying, preserve this evidence because I may be not denied access to these records if I'm fired and taken out of here. So I very much felt like an undercover agent trying to establish. And I said, at the time, this is the kind of stuff congressional hearings are made of.
Yeah.
And I know Carl Levin used that when he had his congressional hearings. You could see this. You could see this coming. I mean, you can see what was going to happen when General Miller went to Iraq and Abu Ghraib. I mean, you could see that bad things were going to result of that trip. I could see it as clear as day. I don't know why other people couldn't see that.
So you never got near swearing out charges against any
I-
fellow Americans?
Uh,
I mean, you write about having an ambition to do that.
Well, I had hoped that one day I might be able to sit down with an Article 31B warning and talk to them about actually what they did and the decisions they made, sure.
So a lot of this book is about the internal battle, the struggle, the debate over what is right and what is wrong. Did you lose any friends over this?
I'm sure, but I'm sure I gained many more. I mean, I had a pretty good reputation in NCS as an operator, and, I had worked, a lion's share of terrorism cases, and so I was quite comfortable with my standing there. And when I made my leadership decisions, I always, I called it, the Trinity of the Triad. I looked at, is this fair to the individual? Is it fair to the organization? Is it fair to myself? And so that was kind of the, what I weighed kind of decisions, because you have to make some decisions, some unpopular decisions at times. And so those are the things I always weighed. But
you weren't keeping company with the ACLU back then.
No,
You
I think it's kind of funny. My friends kid me. Not too long ago, I was out to dinner with Dave Brandt, the former director, Ralph Blinko, the former deputy director, and Mike Gellis, who's in the book, and Bob McFadden, who's in the book, and others. And we kind of talked about this and said, wow, the world is upside down here. You're actually talking to journalists, and, the ACLU is representing you, and you've got Mohammed Slahi, a guy who you investigated, tweeting about how good your book is. So, I spoke out in Paris, France, with General Janis Karpinski, who is here, right here in the audience today, and Alberto Mora and Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, and Nasir Sazi was a Guantanamo detainee, and he's pledged bayat to bin Laden. It was Afghanistan got picked up, and we didn't work a case on him. He was released, and he gave a talk for a television station. And he's a strapping guy with a beard and looks very militant. And he's talking about kind of how he was treated. And when I do countering violent extremism presentations, I often show that video of Nasir, and then the next photograph I show is he and I in a bar in France with our arm around each other, smiling, and talking. They're just people.
So you've been a lifelong liberal. Is what you're saying.
I know when Jess Braven did his book, The Terror Courts, and he talked to me, he said, wow, I always thought you were a jackbooted thug. You actually have a conscience.
That was nice of him.
Sorry, I'm losing my voice
No,
here.
go for it. For those of you who haven't seen the book, it's really bizarrely pockmarked with redactions. As somebody who spent a fair amount of time following the Guantanamo story, I recognize some of the people under the redactions. And anyone who's paid attention to the story would recognize some of the people under the redactions. I don't want to put Mark in the uncomfortable position of telling me he can't tell us who those people are. But when you sat down to write this book, you know many, many things that are classified.
I do.
You are bound not to disclose them. When you sat down to write this book, did you intend to write a book to survive redactions?
Yeah, when I spent my 31 years with the government, 27 as an NCIS special agent, working counterintelligence operations, trying to protect secrets. The last thing I would ever do is try to put classified information in a book, or the last thing I would ever do is talk to a journalist and give them classified information. When I wrote this book, I painstakingly went back through every investigation that I could find. I went back through congressional hearings. I went back through media accounts. I looked at C-SPAN videos of the Senate Armed Services Committee hearings, Judiciary Committee hearings. I tried to ensure that every piece of that book was in the public record. I quoted from newspapers. I quoted from congressional hearings.
Did you write it in a SCIF, a secured classified facility?
No, because I intended not to have anything classified in it.
So when you sat down to write it, you expected that all of it would survive?
I did. I did. And the Department of Defense Pre-Publication Review Office had contacted me and said, hey, we hear you're writing a book. Let us help you get it through the process. We're here to ensure, it's a voluntary process. We're here to, we're for the government, we're here to help you. Let us help you ensure that you don't inadvertently put something in. And I said, great, that's fantastic. How long will the process take? And they said, well, by regulation, it's a 30-day process. We'll try to get it done in 2 weeks. If there's something complex or complicated, it might be a week or two later, it might be 6 weeks. And so I submitted it on the 4th of January this year. And I actually wanted to get it into the public debate to help shape policy before Donald Trump anchored to some things, because I had taken some stands before. A wonderful organization called Human Rights First had come to me years ago and said, we need your voice. We need you to speak out against these things. And I looked at kind of the narrative that the media had at the time, because I had done studies of violent extremism, and I looked at the narrative and the counter-narrative. And the way the media had always reported it was the things that human rights people call torture. And I said, wait a minute, it's torture. It's not just human rights people. I mean,
You take us to the woodshed in your book for that.
Yeah, but
If you didn't hear me, I said he takes us to the woodshed in his book for that.
well, and so it is torture.
So how much of this is already in the public domain? The stuff that we cannot see,
Well,
in your opinion? I'm not asking you what it says, but when
Yeah.
you put pen to paper, you believed it was in the public domain, right?
correct.
Just checking.
Correct. I mean, I would not have, now, yeah, I used to kid that I needed some redactions for street cred. And if I didn't get one, I was going to get a marker and just go through books in bookstores just to kind of help me out a little bit. And I actually submitted it because I was hoping, the ACLU had a case on Mitchell and Jessen, the guys who created this horrible program, the EIT program. And even what they called it, EIT, Enhanced Interrogation Techniques. That was, again, perception management. The EIT program was nothing more than an excuse to inflict torture. That's what it was.
With the fancy name.
Exactly. And when all they added, the only enhancement is that they looked at some research that a guy named Martin Seligman, who was a former president of the APA, had done on dogs.
Also named in your book.
Correct. And it's
They
called
didn't
learned
redact it.
helplessness. And it says if you continue to shock a dog indiscriminately, it will learn helplessness. And it will become obedient and compliant. And so that's what we adopted and utilized and called it enhanced.
So a former Guantanamo prisoner who I believe you know quite well, named Mohammed Slahi, published, with the help of others, Guantanamo Diary, which was his account of what happened to him, actually during the period when you were on duty. And it was quite extensively also redacted. And now he's gone home, and he never had a security clearance. So he was able to sit down with his redacted book and write in the columns what was underneath the black. And so I'm not really pitching this, I'm just setting up a question. So there's a restored edition here, which basically has the words that were redacted. And so my question is, have you ever considered moving to Mauritania so that you can tell us what's in there?
Well, Slahi is an amazing guy. I mean, he's got a great sense of humor. I mean, I was at the 60 Minutes did a story on him, and he's got a pretty dry wit and good sense of humor. At the time, the job of an investigator is to find facts. Our job isn't to try cases. And so when the investigators for the CITF saw the things that was happening to Slahi, they identified those to the prosecutor, a guy named Stu Couch at the time. And Stu, a very honorable Marine, made the decision that based on the manner in which Slahi was treated, he could not.
He was unprosecutable.
Yeah, he became, just as, Katani had become unprosecutable based on that.
So some civilians in the military or in the Department of Defense concluded that people became unprosecutable for things that happened at Guantanamo, but yet people are being prosecuted at Guantanamo for things with similar episodes, if not worse, that happened elsewhere.
Yeah, pretty ironic, isn't it?
Not sure what it is. Why do you think it took so long to clear?
Well,
Do you think they were slow rolling it because they
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
want you participating in
Yeah.
the national debate?
Yeah, clearly, from my perspective, they were. So when I saw the delays occurring, I called them and said, listen, what's the problem here? You know, I can cite where things came from. If somebody has an issue, let me know, and I'll tell them that, you know, this part is in the Senate Armed Service Committee, this is in the Taguba report, this is in the Schlesinger report, the Schmidt-Furlow report, the General Jacoby report, the FBI IG, I've read them all. You know, I'll point out exactly
Where in the public
where
domain
in the
it
public
exists?
domain you could find this. And then they said, well, I said, well, what agency did you give it to that has a problem? Let me talk to them. And they said, we can't tell you who we gave your book to. And I said, wait a minute, I've been with the government for 3 decades. You can't tell me who you gave my work product to? Something smells and it's not on my shoes. You may have heard that before, Mr. Highlands. And so at that point, I suspected, because I knew there was a case on Mitchell and Jessen, and the ACLU was waiting for my manuscript. And their discovery deadline was, I think it was February 17th. And so when I submitted my manuscript, I did it on January 4th, believing the government, those people that were there helped me, that they'd get it done in a month or 6 weeks.
That would become part of that case.
And then, I mean, I think that the context that I provide would be useful about the origins, the efficacy, and the damage to national security that the torture program established. And so I thought to myself, this is the problem. They want that discovery deadline to pass. And then Donald Trump nominated someone for the deputy director of the CIA who, by the congressional hearings and by the media accounts, said that she was the chief of one of the black sites. And so I said, uh-oh, now, although I don't name her in my book and I don't talk about the black sites or anything else.
Available in 2 Googles.
Pardon me?
Her name is available in 2 Googles.
Okay, well, and so I just thought, okay, now, you know, because when you submit these things, generally lawyers are going to get them. And so I'm anticipating that some lawyer for the CIA is like, uh-oh, I don't want this information to kind of stir things up to ruin these hearings on my potential boss. And there are people that I name in the book who have been redacted who are current government officials at some senior executive levels within the Department of Defense and some people within some other agencies. And so those delays, you know, I just saw the delays being compounded. And what I found when I asked the ACLU for help, they were amazing. The ACLU and Knights Columbia, the First Amendment folks who kind of had worked with the ACLU were just tremendous. And I realized that, you know, they are protecting the Constitution. I mean, that First Amendment is what they're doing. So you know, their job was like my job, protecting and defending the Constitution. And what I found, I don't know if it's ironic, but it was 22 days after we decided to go public. We were trying to work with the government, with the ACLU and Knights, saying, listen, he's willing to come to DC and sit down with you. He'll point out, you know, where these things came from, and they were unwilling to do so. And so we decided to write letters to 6 senators, and I had spent some time on Capitol Hill on behalf of Human Rights First, for lack of a better term, lobbying senators, asking them to pass the McCain-Feinstein Anti-Torture Act, asking them to release the torture report. I've taken a stand that, you know, Guantanamo is against our values. I mean, it's become a symbol of injustice and oppression, something that could have been an opportunity had we did this right, had we served as an example, has become an opportunity lost right now, and it's a symbol. It's a symbol of, that is driving more people to violent extremism. I know I was part of a project at West Point where they were looking at the tactical consequence of torture and kind of the effects on the battlefield. And up at the Carr Center at Harvard, they're looking at the strategic consequence of torture.
We're going to go to questions, but there's one question I've always wanted to ask somebody who was there in the early days, and you have a unique insight. And how conceptually do professionals come up with the concept of a puppet show, of a captive having sex with Osama bin Laden? Where conceptually do professionals come up with the idea of wrapping someone in the Israeli flag, all in the context of interrogation? What is the thinking by which they use women for this, sexual humiliation? I'm not asking you to defend it, because it's clear if you read the book, this was not, you didn't approve of this. But how do Americans come to the conclusion that these are things that are going to work?
When you think no one can see what you're doing, when you operate without transparency, no one was supposed to know about the CIA EIT program. Other people in the CIA weren't supposed to know about it.
But that's the embarrassment factor. So, nobody would want the world to know about something as ham-handed or cruel or whatever word you want to. But if you're a thinking interrogator, why do you think something like that would work?
Yeah, the thought process then, shaped by what I call the pseudo behavioral science consulting team, that this team established by the generals at Guantanamo, which were separate from the operational psychologists, and that's, I hope I correct the record on that, because there were two opposing battles of psychologists, and so we had career operational psychologists working at the CITF, folks from agencies in the intelligence community, helping us develop rapport-based approaches. Each investigative unit that I established had their own lawyers, their own intelligence analysts, their own investigators, and their own operational psychologists. And you had psychologists on the other side who had no experience, were clinical psychologists. But what they were doing is they were saying that if you reduce them to this learned helplessness, if you break them down, if you treat them like dogs, if they learn that helplessness, somehow they rationalize that truth would suddenly come out of them.
So was it a lack of understanding of how interrogations work with integrity, or was it a lack of understanding about Islam?
I can't answer that question. I don't know what could have been going through their minds when someone would dress up in a cowboy outfit complete with chaps and walk into an interrogation room and think that, okay, that's going to prime someone to tell me something. They're just, at one point we tried to jointly, we wanted to help them, the JTF folks, and we tried to do tiger teams where we tried to blend the CITF, the FBI, and the military. But their training at Fort Huachuca, where they're trained how to do interrogations, and again, vice investigators who do interrogations, a lot of it is coercive in nature. So they have techniques, ego down harsh and pride down, and so their training is that if you kind of apply those techniques, somehow it will break someone.
So individuals dreamt up this crazy stuff, or people sat around and brainstormed and said, let's send them in chaps?
Yeah, well, some of it, as the Senate Armed Service Committee site, you had a psychologist and a psychiatrist with the pseudo BSCT take those Bitterman techniques that you really describing there, and just made up a couple more. And a lawyer,
lot more.
Yeah, a lawyer from the CIA came to Guantanamo and basically said, if a detainee dies, you're doing it wrong.
Yes.
And so that was kind of the parameters. That was in...
And that's physical cruelty, but I guess the other stuff, the theatrical stuff, and we're going to go to questions. So thank you guys for indulging me. Would someone like to ask a question? We have two. We have many. Why don't you go right there? Sorry. Why don't you start there? We'll go that way. No, you can have the microphone.
Me?
Yes,
Start?
please.
Is it on? Oh. Hi, my name's Heather Craig, and I'm with the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. And so I'm sure you're well aware that there's a preliminary investigation happening currently in Afghanistan. It's been going on for a number of years now. And there has been a lot of talk about the fact that the prosecutor is potentially going to open a request, I should say, the judges to open an investigation into Afghanistan, and a lot of the allegations are against U.S. service members for torture, among other things. So my question is to you, how do you feel about something like that moving forward? And also, what do you feel, or how do you feel that this administration would react to it? And, the United States position regarding the ICC has not been a favorable one for many years, and especially, this administration is even worse as far as I'm concerned. So I'm wondering what you think their reaction would be.
So where do you come down on our troops facing international justice?
Okay, well, let me go to the first part, and then I'll go to the second part. And so, while President Obama, when he issued Executive Order 13491, which said we will not torture and we will abide by the Geneva Conventions and our own laws, which is rather startling to start with, that you need an executive order to say you will do so. One of the things that I was highly disappointed in was when he said we need to look forward, not backwards. And so that policy of impunity, that inability to hold anyone accountable in some measure, is what enabled the torture lobby to continue to bring us down a road which will degrade our national security. And so I know at the time, Senator Pat Leahy on the Senate Judiciary Committee had lobbied against that and said that, we need to do something because, I'm sure you guys know from the Senate Armed Service Committee report, it's quite clear what we did, and it's quite clear who did it. It's a matter of congressional record. The narrative continues to try to avoid blame and classify, redact, and hide what we did and who did it. But Senator Leahy said, let's hold truth commissions. We need some measure of accountability so that we don't go down this road again. And so, my hopes are that there is some pressure. I spoke at the UN General Assembly in September, and I said that, I hope that the international community continues to pressure my government so that we do our jobs, so that we adhere to our Constitution. I hope you push for that accountability so that we internally recognize that we need to do something to hold people accountable in some measure. So I think there needs to be some accountability at some level.
But are you willing to throw our fates to the International Court?
That's not my decision. I'm just a citizen.
She's asking your opinion, though.
There needs to be some accountability. Whether that is. I'm not a political pundit. I'm just a guy who is concerned about our national security. I took that oath of office, and I still believe it's true today that I have to protect and defend that Constitution. So the second part of your question, I think Donald Trump will try to crush you. I think that he will do anything he can, and I'm really concerned for our country right now. I'm concerned that Donald Trump ran on a war crimes campaign. He ran saying we will waterboard and do more than waterboarding. He said we will take oil from Iraq. That's a war. It's called it's called pillaging. These are war crimes. I'm astounded that people haven't recognized that in this country. And I wrote letters again on behalf of an organization that I do some. I collaborate with Human Rights First, and we wrote letters to presidential candidates, and I had signed them, asking particularly the Republican candidates, hey, let this guy talk to you, and he'll tell you what really happened privately. And two candidates, their chiefs of staff, talked to me. Donald Trump's campaign was not one, and we went public with the letter to try to put pressure on those candidates. But I'm troubled right now. Because I know the media likes to talk about candidate Trump and President Trump and did he pivot? There's one Donald Trump, And, Donald Trump said we're going to build a wall, and somehow we're going to have some kind of wall somewhere. And Donald Trump said we're going to, do more than waterboarding, and I'm afraid that we're going to revert back to things that are war crimes. I'm troubled now. I haven't seen the news. I've been pretty busy in the last couple of days. I'm troubled that we have a U.S. citizen in custody somewhere, and he has not been, at least to my knowledge, yet brought before some legitimate judicial process. I'm troubled by who might be interviewing him or interrogating him. I'm troubled by the conditions of his confinement because I know Appendix M to the Army Field Manual has isolation in there, and isolation is the key to confabulation. Isolation is the key to false confessions. Going back to the 56 congressional hearings, which I've read word for word, going back to the techniques that the Soviet Union used for false confessions. It's all based on this isolation. And so I'm troubled now, and I continue to privately challenge the media about why aren't we reporting about this? Who is now talking to this U.S. citizen, and what are we going to do with him? Is he going to wind up at Guantanamo? Is he going to be a forever prisoner? Are we going to try him before an Article III court? What will be the disposition of this citizen that's being held somewhere by my government, by your government?
I think there's some attorneys in the room who would be smacking their lips at him winding up at Guantanamo, because it would open up a whole new level of challenge to detention there. Sir.
Thank you. My question will zoom from the micro to the macro. Any interrogator knows that if you torture an interrogatee, that they'll tell you anything that they want just to stop the torture. The purpose of interrogation is to provide timely, accurate, and actionable information. Given that, and given that the fact that that you saw it turn into a state-sponsored terrorist torture program, and you saw people being fired for standing up, you were thinking of an exit strategy, you prevented your agents from going into interrogations because they may be prosecuted later on for having seen those. So given that, in that maybe what we don't know as far as the 9/11 Commission being truthful or not, or fully complete, the information that was there, I'm curious as to the intel that you've had access to and what you have seen. Is this not a bigger cover story in that you are able to go ahead and get the interrogatees to tell you whatever you want them to tell you? So then you can further your foreign policy agenda and give cover for any previous actions or inactions, failed intel action that should have been taken that was not, so that you're basically giving yourself a cover story.
So are you asking if they threw the interrogations on purpose?
So if you look at General Wesley Clark on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman talking about how he went to the Pentagon after 2001, and he goes in there and a colonel brings him into the office and he says, "Colonel, I'll give the short summary, we're basically going to invade 7 countries in 5 years." That has now happened. And if you look at the arms deals that are going on with ISIS, as far as the different stuff that's going on in the Middle East, this gives perfect cover story that then the American public never questions. And I'm kind of curious as to wherever you want to go with this question.
Sure. Well, may I hold this book up? So that's the question that I hope that this book will provoke. And so, sorry, I just had to do that for my publicist to make sure I'm holding my book up. So the question that I think a thoughtful person would have is, were these techniques utilized to intentionally obtain the policy information that we wanted? And so, the example I like to use is Ibn Sheikh Alibi. He was an emir of the Khaldan training camp, and so Alibi was in Bagram, and Alibi was someone that I was looking at for military commissions because we knew who he was, and he wound up in a foreign prison in Egypt, and he was tortured, and he said there was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And at the time, when that information came back to the Pentagon to me, I said, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense with anything that we're tracking at the CITF. This doesn't make sense with anything that we've learned previously. We had analysts looking at the different training camps and what they did and other things. And so that string of intelligence was inconsistent with what we knew at that point. And so I was challenging it in the Pentagon, saying that this isn't making sense. And they kept saying, well, we have this, rock solid source. And so what happened is, Colin Powell went to the United Nations, and part of what he utilized was there was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And President George Bush went to Cincinnati, Ohio, and told the American public there was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so to support policy decisions to invade Iraq, we utilized information. When Ibn Sheikh al-Libi was released, he said he just made that up so the pain would stop. And so and that's one of the things I hope it comes through in the book, is kind of the strategic consequence of torture, where flawed policy decisions are made. So once the foundation is corrupted, once you've kind of accepted that and you just utilize it for your policy decisions, it's going to cost lives. And we then turn over Ibn Sheikh al-Libi to Libya, and he allegedly commits suicide in his cell.
Right after seeing someone from Human Rights Watch the day before.
Exactly. So it's detrimental to our national security.
Can I ask for shorter questions? But, sir, I'm sorry to do that, but we're past time.
I'm particularly
And shorter.
interested in the dynamics of the group of people who are devising and applying these torturous techniques. Did they form a kind of fraternal sodality among themselves, drinking and eating together and reinforcing each other and creating a kind of moral hothouse, which would allow them to do things which most of us would think are reprehensible and criminal?
Yeah, one of the things that's kind of lost, in the public domain is the level of resistance within the CIA. There were people who resigned from the CIA, who left black sites. There were people who would not do this. Some of the people who have issued blurbs about my book are CIA officers. There were friends of mine who stood up against this. There were people internal to the CIA who couldn't believe what was happening. So this was a small rogue pocket of individuals with very limited experience who were supposed to be operating without other people in the CIA even knowing about it. It was meant to be a secretive program, but people were disgusted by it to the brink of tears walking out of these black sites. And there were people within the CIA complaining particularly about Mitchell and Jessen, because these were two contractors with no experience, and they designed, developed, implemented, and evaluated their own program. And their contract was for $183 million. They got $81 million, and it wasn't until the Abu Ghraib scandal broke that contract was terminated. But people made millions on this torture program. I call them the modern day equivalent of snake oil salesmen. They sold the bill of goods, and there were people, I can't mention their names because they're redacted, from the CIA who left the CIA to go work for the contractor to do the torture program. And these are terrible conflicts of interest.
Can we do 3 more questions? 1, 2, 3.
Hi, I'm Colleen Kelly from September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. I have 2 questions. One is the documents that you were sending back to friends in the NCIS, where do those documents live now? And secondly, I agree with you about the need for some accountability for the torture program. It seems that the military commissions now have become kind of the sole vessel for torture to be discovered and through the discovery process, and not that individuals will be held accountable, but that the information will at least possibly come to some light. I'd be very interested in your opinion about who exactly should be held accountable and what method of accountability you would counsel.
Yeah, one of the reasons I believe that we need accountability, we need to come clean on torture because we need to bring the terrorists to justice who attacked us. And those sailors that died on the Cole died on my watch. And I was the chief investigator for Al-Qaeda after 9/11. And so My job was to bring those terrorists to justice. And as a country, we were unable to do so because we keep trying to hide the fact that we tortured people. We tortured some folks, as President Obama said. We keep trying to protect this. I think Dianne Feinstein, after the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, said, if we look to hold people accountable, it'd probably be like 50 or 60 people, or some number under 100, whatever it was. And so look at what we've done to our national standing. Look at the families who are going through what they're going through today, where we're unable to bring people to justice because of the torture that we committed, and the fact that we're unwilling to admit that. And so people sit in indefinite detention, and families travel to Guantanamo to try to see trials and see these people brought to justice, and they're unable to. I read in the news that computers were taken, I think read from you, Carol, computers were taken from defense attorneys. Defense attorneys have found listening devices where they're having meetings with their clients. I mean, the levels that we're going to try to protect the fact that we torture some people when everybody knows it is just amazing. And so until we reconcile with that, we're going to continue to just hold people, and families are going to suffer because they've lost loved ones. And so I continue to speak out that we need to, until we do that, we're always going to run into this problem in Guantanamo where it's considered an illegitimate judicial process.
Josh, you'll be the closer. And then we've got to wrap it up.
I'm Todd Pierce. I'm a retired Army officer, JAG officer. I represented prisoners at Guantanamo. So we talked a little bit about accountability here. We've got a War Crimes Act that was passed, 20 years or so ago, which applies directly to the many military and CIA officers who were involved in this, yet it's never been applied, even talked about, being invoked for charging these criminals, war criminals, our own officials. And then furthermore, when civil suits have been brought against the torturers by a number of different people, victims, the torturers are allowed free by arguing that we acted in, actually the government argues this, they acted within the scope of their employment, the modern day equivalent of as just following orders. So I guess I'm getting toward, last summer I went through a Stasi prison. Back in the day, the Stasi was seen as one of the most disreputable intelligence agencies. So a former Stasi prisoner walked me through the prison that he had been held in, explaining what was going on. And of course, a lot of memories coming back about what I heard about Guantanamo, except what he was telling me about the Stasi didn't approach what was done at Guantanamo. And also, in Paris, I picked up a book that was just published by a survivor of a Gestapo investigation, a woman, French-Jewish woman, who was accused and was guilty of resistance activities, what the Nazis called terrorism. This is apart from the Holocaust, but investigation of resistance. And she was treated much less harshly than we treat people down at Guantanamo. So I guess what I'm leading up to is amongst your older colleagues, at least, who were part of the Cold War and understood a little bit about the Nazis, was there ever a sense of shame that the things that we used to claim to be fighting against, they represented better than the people that we were fighting against on these issues? And second, this goes, this is just apart from being a lawyer or anything, but this was perversion. Is there a sense of shame amongst these people that what perverts they've been in the many things they did? And one final thing is, it's not just the people that were working with Jessen and Mitchell. You talk to people who just routine treatment in Guantanamo, and again, that was torture in itself, even if they weren't waterboarded. I won't go through the list of things. Physicians for human rights have talked about this, but just the ordinary treatment they were given by the guards went into torture. And then one final thing is 16 years of this, 16 years of torture, the Republicans talking about it, advocating it. This didn't start with Donald Trump. We've normalized it so much that Trump was a predictable outcome of it, I would argue, not an aberration. So why are we surprised that Trump should get elected by bragging about how much torture he would do? So again.
Okay, there's about 5 questions there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to answer it by reading something here from my book, if I could find it here.
And then Josh will ask the last question.
And so On September 17th, 1775, the anniversary date of when we issued the memorandum of notification establishing the torture program in the CIA, George Washington sat on his camp at Cambridge, and he issued orders to his troops. And he was concerned because we were going across the border into Canada, and he was concerned with the manner in which his troops might treat prisoners or might treat the public. And what George Washington said, should any American soldier be so base and infamous as to injure any prisoner, I do most earnestly enjoin you to bring him to such severe and exemplary punishment as the enormity of the crime may require. Should it extend to death itself, it will not be disproportional to its guilt at such a time and such a cause. For by such conduct they bring shame, disgrace, and ruin to themselves and their country. And that's what I think this program did.
And I missed the beginning, so if you cover this, then we're done. One of your colleagues, who was a military interrogator, not necessarily Guantanamo, but has said, at least privately, that the willingness to torture or the tolerance for torture was directly proportional to the religiosity of the interrogator. So I want to know to what extent you agree that there was a measure of religious intolerance or otherness with respect to the program, and if so, how do you weed that out in the context of providing a measure of prevention?
Can I just clarify, the more devout they were, the more willing they were?
Yes. Well, the more they saw it as a sort of as a religious crusade almost, or at least...
And the more secular people were, the more troubled they were?
And reluctant or resistant.
I have no idea.
Thank you, last word.
No, I just want to make a comment about that.
General Jarkinski.
And it answers a comment you made before.
Yes, ma'am.
How the program was established and why they started out in the wrong direction, because it was a complete lack of understanding of Islam, of the mentality of Middle Eastern culture, a complete lack of understanding. And if you start with the most important thing, or seemingly the most important thing was the religious aspects, if you start from complete misunderstanding, maybe it was intentional. Maybe they wanted the interrogators to have no understanding, so this program could take effect very quickly. They were off track from the beginning. And whatever efforts you made at your level or in the Pentagon or wherever it was, nobody wanted to listen because this ignorance of the culture and their beliefs and what would be effective just dovetailed perfectly into this ignorance in how to torture or interrogate or what's effective or what isn't.
So the answer to my question is both, ma'am.
I mean, it was from the beginning. We don't care how they think. We don't care what they believe. We're going to do this, and we're going to win by doing it our way.
It seems to me that we've been having this conversation for an awfully long time. I mean, how many events have we done on torture and Guantanamo over the past 15 years since we started down at NYU? And it's so interesting that so many of us have had time, and you have had time to reflect on it, and it still seems not to have changed the conversation enough. And I think, I think our great-grandchildren are going to be really disappointed in us. So I keep hoping that in a couple of years it'll sort of, come out in a different way. But I do think that books like Mark Fallon's are very important for this because it keeps the conversation alive, and I'm glad they delayed it because now it's our conversation now and not then. And I think the work a lot of you in the audience have done has been really helpful. But I think the basic takeaway, echoing Janice's and the rest of you, is, once you break something this fundamental, can you ever fix it? And that was the dilemma that President Obama faced. And so I want to thank our wonderful guests tonight, and I want to thank all of you for being so generous.